Hey everyone, welcome back. I am the Closet Catholic, and today I'm going to be wrapping up the series where I'm discussing my journey into the Catholic Church, and I'm going to wrap it up by talking about the Bible. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into it. So this is something that was never really discussed when I was a Protestant. It was something that I took some classes on, like in talking about, well, not classes about the Bible specifically and how it developed, but talking about church history, the development of the biblical canon, or how we got the Bible and the books that are in it, was something that was touched on in some of my Bible history classes. I don't recall it being labored on that much. And so this was something that was pretty surprising to me when I started to research it myself. And this video is going to be pretty short. There's a lot I could say about this, especially with my background. My undergraduate was biblical studies, so this was something that was pretty important to me. It is something that's pretty important to me. There's a lot I could say about it, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to try to keep it pretty brief. So before we jump in, I just want to make a couple clarifications here. So when talking about the Bible, especially in the conversation between Catholics and Protestant, because they do have different books in their Bibles, which is essentially what I'm talking about today, of why there's a difference there and why the Catholic Bible is the correct version of the Bible, which is what I'm talking about. There's a couple terms that are generally thrown around, and I just want to clarify what they mean, because unfortunately they're used interchangeably, and I just think that's a mistake. So the first term that people might be familiar with is Apocrypha. So Protestants refer to the extra books in the Catholic Bible as the apocryphal writings. Well, that's a very inaccurate term to use. I don't like using it because Apocrypha simply means writings that are not considered genuine. And it's a very general term. You could use this to refer to any number of writings in any number of religions. It's not something that's just within Christianity. So the term that I like to use is the Deuterocanon. Deuterocanon is a very specific term. It refers to those writings that are a part of the Catholic Old Testament, but not a part of the Protestant Old Testament. And in particular, Deuterocanon refers to Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Baruch, Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, as well as additions to Daniel and Esther. So for the sake of the conversation, just for clarity, I'm going to be using the term Deuterocanon to refer to those extra books that are, I shouldn't even say extra, because I'm sort of conceding a Protestant point if I say that. They're referring to the works that are a part of the Catholic Bible that are not a part of the Protestant Bible, the Deuterocanon. So what really got me started in exploring this was I was leading a small group, and someone in the small group said, hey, could we talk sometime about these other books, like the Book of Enoch or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary or stuff like that? And essentially, why do we have the Bible that we have? Like, why do we accept some books but not other books that we're familiar with, that were written around the same time, that seem to have similar content, that discuss similar themes and topics and stuff? Why do we have these as sacred scripture but not these? And so what I did is I said, okay, like that sounds great. I love talking about that, so let's talk about it because I've taught on it before. And in preparation for that, I really wanted to make sure that I was conveying accurate information to my group when we were going through that. And so what I did is I went to primary sources. So I was familiar enough with the history of how the Bible developed to look at certain early church councils, where that was discussed, and how the Bible came together. And I was pretty shocked, actually. And the question that I really wrestled with was, is the Protestant 66 book Bible correct? Because, well, I guess I'll get into this in a minute. But here's the thing. In my experience, in my background as a Protestant, there were certain things that I assumed, there were certain things that I was taught, and there were certain things that I just observed. So I kind of want to break this down so you know where I was coming from when I really began to wrestle with the books that are in the Catholic Bible, not the Protestant Bible. So here's the thing. I always assumed that the Bible was, and always has been, recognized as containing 66 books of the Old and New Testament. 39 books of the Old Testament, 27 books of the New Testament. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. It's not like just any collection of 66 books. It's these specific books. I just assumed that's the Bible. That's always been the Bible. Sure, you could talk about how the early church councils recognized Scripture, but the Bible has always been, as far as the church is concerned, these 66 books. Right? That's just something I assumed, never really questioned it. But then when I was in college, there were certain things that I was taught. And I was taught that the Old Testament, what we also call the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish canon, it was set before Christ. So the Jews already had their, what we call the Old Testament, they already had that set. They already recognized those 39 books. And so Christians merely inherited what the Jews already recognized as Scripture. And then the Christians also had their writings, which we later recognized as the New Testament. Okay, that's what I was taught. Another thing I was taught was that the New Testament, 27 books, those were recognized as Scripture at the councils of Hippo and Carthage, which were two African church councils that took place in 393 or 394 for Hippo and in 397 for Carthage. Because at those councils, the subject of what constitutes Scripture was being discussed. People were asking questions. There was some variety among different Christian communities of, well, what books should we recognize as Scripture, what ones we don't. And so the councils met to kind of settle the matter and say, okay, well, what books do we recognize as Scripture and what ones should we reject as sacred Scripture? Which, even though they might be helpful texts, what's divinely inspired and what's not. So they set out to recognize those. And I was taught about those councils. Funny enough, thinking back, we never looked at the actual writings of the councils, which they're pretty brief. I'm surprised we didn't. Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, and you'll find out why. Of why the councils were not actually quoted in any of my classes. I was a bit deceived. And the thing is, you can look up for yourself. Just type into Google, the Council of Hippo, 393, or the Council of Carthage, 397. You can read for yourself what was discussed there among the early Christians and what they recognize as Scripture. But anyways, I was taught that those councils were specifically just for the New Testament, and that's where we get the New Testament today, is from those councils. Another thing that I was taught, and I find this to be pretty interesting, is that yes, Catholics do have more books in their Bible, but Catholics don't view those books, the Deuterocanon, as divinely inspired Scripture. They might see them as helpful, maybe historical works to help us better understand the context of what's going on in the Bible in between the Old and New Testaments, but they're not recognized as divinely inspired Scripture. I think this is a really weird position to take, but that's what I was taught, and that's what I taught as well. To my shame, when I was a pastor, and even before that, when I was a teaching assistant at my university, that's what I taught. Is there's these extra books, but they're not. The church never received them as divinely inspired Scripture, but they include them in some versions of the Bible because they're helpful books, I guess, which again is sort of dumb. But regardless, that's what I was taught. That's what I propagated myself. That's what I believed. And actually, as time went on, I wasn't taught this. I didn't assume this myself. It's just something that I've observed in the conversation between Catholics and Protestant, and that Protestants just sort of assume and they claim that the Council of Trent in 1546, which was a response to the Protestant Reformation, added the Deuterocanon to the Bible. That before this time, there was just the 66 books, but then the Catholics, seeing what the Protestants were doing, said, no, we're going to add these 7 books to the Bible because they back up what we believe. That's essentially the claim. I never bought into that because I just didn't know enough. But it is something that I heard. So there's that. Except here's the problem. When you actually look at history, And none of this is secret, by the way. It's fairly objective history. Anyone can look it up. It's not like this is within the realm of just biblical scholars. Anyone can do Google searches and look at even primary sources for this information. But when you look at history, you'll find that the Old Testament, and you can even see this specific thing within Scripture. You can tell that the Old Testament was not universally accepted among Jews before, during, or even shortly after the time of Christ. So there was no universally accepted Old Testament canon of Scripture. The Jews didn't have a set number of books, the 39 books that Protestants have, as their scriptures. There was actually multiple competing traditions. You see this among the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and possibly others. Because some of it is sort of, lost to the sands of time. We don't know a whole lot. But we do know that there were at least 3 different schools of thought regarding which books are divinely inspired and which ones aren't. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes all had different views on which books were and were not scripture. For example, the Sadducees only recognized the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as scripture. Everything else was not. The Pharisees had a much larger canon of scripture. There is some debate on what exactly that includes. Protestants claim that the Pharisees had the 39 books, and so that's what the Christians inherited, which may be the case. I mean, I have no problem conceding that point that, sure, the Pharisees had the same 39 books of the Old Testament as the Protestants do. I mean, if you want to say we're just copying what the Pharisees did, then I think that undercuts other Protestant claims. But regardless, that is a claim that's out there, and it may be the case. And the Essenes also seem to have a different understanding of Scripture as well, of what constitutes Scripture. The thing that's interesting about this point, though, in talking about that Christians just inherited the Scriptures from the Jews, is that the idea of a canon of Scripture, of a set collection of books that are divinely inspired, that are authoritative for all believers everywhere, is, as a matter of history, more of a Christian concept. Because again, you had these different Jewish traditions that had their own different collections, but Jews as a whole didn't really see a problem with that. Whereas in Christianity, it was much more important to have, there's a set collection of books that are divinely inspired, that are applicable and binding for all Christians everywhere, not just different versions of Christianity. And I'm not going to get into Eastern Orthodoxy. That's a totally different concept, or a totally different subject. I'm just talking about Catholic and Protestant here. Anyways, so that whole claim of Christianity just inherited the Bible from the Jews is kind of anachronistic, because it assumes that the idea of a set canon of Scripture was something that predated Christianity, which I think it's going to be tough to make that claim, just looking at the history. The other thing is that the councils that I mentioned, the councils of Hippo and Carthage, those same councils that recognized the New Testament canon of Scripture also recognized, in the exact same rulings, by the way, they didn't include it separately, they recognized the Deuterocanon as Scripture. So when you look at the councils of Hippo and Carthage, and really those two are related because Carthage is just affirming what Hippo says. But anyways, when you look at those councils, they list out specifically the books that we accept these as divinely inspired, and nothing else should be read in worship outside of these writings. And they include the Deuterocanon. They list 73 books there. The 73 books that the Catholic Church has in their Bible. They list those. I mean, it's explicit. It's not even something of, we include these 39 books. We also include these separate books called the Deuterocanon, and then we also include the New Testament canon over here. No, it's one list where they have these books. And that's in the first time you see it is the Council of Rome in 382. The Council of Rome really doesn't get discussed in Protestant circles. I don't know why I wasn't taught about it, because it's in Rome. Like, historically at the time, that was the center of Christianity that's I guess you could argue Antioch certainly had a lot of influence. Constantinople did too. That's all a side point. Anyways, the Council of Rome, they have that whole list. That's in 382. The Council of Hippo in 393. It's listed under canon. It depends on what source you're looking at because they number it differently, but it's the same canon, either 36, 27, or 24, whatever. Anyways, it's listed there at Council of Hippo. It's also listed there at the Council of Carthage. At none of the Christian councils, none of them. You could even throw the Council of Florence in here. I believe that was in the 13th century, maybe 15th. I'm forgetting which one. Anyways, you look throughout church history, there is no Christian council that affirms the 39 books of the Protestant Old Testament. If they talk about scripture, if they list it out, it has the Deuterocanon in it. I mean, you can't escape it. I've never heard a good argument for doing that. And so when you come to the Council of Trent, which again was in the 16th century, the Council of Trent merely affirmed what had been accepted by the church since the 4th century. And the reason they did this, some people might say, well, why did the Council of Trent even discuss the which writings are scripture or not? The reason they did that is because Protestants were questioning their validity. Because for the previous 1100 years, there was no dispute. The councils of Rome, Hippo, and Carthage already laid out, these are what we recognize as divinely inspired scripture, and the church accepted it. No one argued with it, so there was no reason to have another council on the issue until the Council of Trent, where Protestants, motivated by Luther, started questioning whether or not those books are legitimate, divinely inspired scripture. So the Council of Trent, again, they just copied what Rome, Hippo, and Carthage said. And you can find this if you look up the Council of Trent, Session 4, under the decree concerning the canonicity of the scriptures. Like it's right there. So that's the problem. That the Protestant 66-book canon, it doesn't exist until the 1600s. But even then, the Deuterocanon was still printed in the Protestant Bibles. It was just moved to an appendix of the Bible, and it was cross-referenced. So you have, you'll be reading the Protestant Old Testament, the Protestant New Testament. Well, New Testament's the same between Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestants. That doesn't matter. But you're reading the Protestant Old Testament along with the New Testament, and you'll have instances where you'll be reading a certain verse, and then you'll be pointed to a book and passage of the Deuterocanon because they are cross-referenced. There are references to the Deuterocanon in the New Testament. There are allusions in the Old Testament. So it was still being cross-referenced, and this is probably going to be surprising to a lot of people. It was a shock to me that the first Bible printed without the Deuterocanon, whether it was an appendix or not, the first Bible printed without the Deuterocanon doesn't happen until the late 1800s, less than 200 years ago. Some people put this as in the 1850s or 1860s. Some people put it as late as the 1890s, where the first Bible was printed without the Deuterocanon. So the Protestant 66-book canon, in the form that we have today, doesn't exist until less than 200 years ago. I mean, that's less than 200 years old. That's crazy. When you talk about, that's not even 10% of church history that the Protestant Bible has existed. And again, it's a simple matter of history. You can't argue around it. At least I haven't been convinced that you can, because again, you can look it up yourself. Right? This isn't secret information. So here's a conclusion I came to. Why be Protestant? So when it came to the matter of the Deuterocanon, this was the final nail in the coffin for me of why I can't be Protestant. Because as a fact of history, Protestants intentionally removed books from the Bible. And so the 66-book canon is at best, the best argument you could make is that it's maybe 500 years old, going all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. And I couldn't remain Protestant after that because They don't even have the correct Bible. They don't have all the scriptures. What am I missing here? Maybe there's certain Christian teaching that I'm not privy to because maybe not intentionally, maybe not maliciously, but people just haven't taught me that Protestants don't have the full scriptures. They have an incomplete version of the Bible. So, yeah, that was something that really hit me less than 2 years ago, actually. It was in 2021. I'm pretty sure it was in 2021 where I did sort of my own personal study on this just to get more familiar with the source material, talking about the Deuterocanon, what it is, where it comes from. And I was convinced. I was convinced that, yeah, the Deuterocanon is scripture. The church, the earliest Christians recognize it as scripture. I read the New Testament. I actually see references to the Deuterocanon. I see it being treated as scripture by scripture itself. So I just couldn't escape that, and that was really tough for me, because, like in my first video where I talk about worship and what I wrestled with there, even in talking about history, if you look at that video, even talking about authority, you could make persuasive arguments around that and still justify being Protestant. And I know that because I did. I could justify remaining Protestant because even though I recognize certain things there that were problematic, I could argue around it and I could convince myself, yeah, it's still fine to be Protestant even with those issues. This was one where I couldn't argue against it. I just recognized, yeah, the Bible that Protestants use, it's not correct. There's missing books here. And I just couldn't justify that anymore. So I just couldn't tolerate being Protestant after that. So anyway, so that is it for my journey. That was the last part. Again, it was short. I do want to point you to a couple resources, though. The first is this channel, Apocrypha Apocalypse. There was a lot that I was going to say about the Deuterocanon and maybe even do a series of it on it. But then I stumbled on this channel. It's by Gary Machuda, if anyone's familiar with him. And he goes into much more detail than I could, and he does a much better job presenting it. So I'm just going to point people here. So it's Apocrypha Apocalypse. In particular, his playlist, The Deuterocanon is Scripture, is really well done. There should be a 7th video. I don't know why there's only 6. Because in the last video here, he even says, and next time we'll be talking about yada yada. So maybe he just forgot to put it in this playlist and it's somewhere else on his channel. I'm not sure. So check out the Deuterocanon in Scripture series. It's really good. He does a great job with it. Also, if you look under his videos, he doesn't have a playlist for this, and I'm not sure why. It's really well done. It's The Great Protestant Cover-Up, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are really well done. He covers the history of how the Protestant canon came to be, and some of the tensions there, some of the nuance there. It's really well done. So I would definitely want to point you there, as well as this was interesting too. I would recommend watching Gary Machuda's videos first, at least the Deuterocanon is Scripture series, that's good, and then come back and watch this debate. It's called The Great Debate 9. Is the Apocrypha Scripture? It's a debate between James White and Gary Machuda. It's really interesting. Gary Machuda does a really great job here. And this is from, like the 90s, I think? Somewhere. Don't read the description, though. I don't know who wrote this description of this video. It's obviously very biased. And I'm not sure if they watched the same debate that I did, but regardless, I definitely want to point you in those directions. So check those out if you want to know more about the Deuterocanon and just, brush up on your understanding of it and the history of it. I would recommend that. So, but that's going to do it for my journey. That's it, start to finish. So the things I wrestled with in becoming Catholic were the nature and purpose of worship, the historical roots of the Christian faith, the matter and issue of authority. How do I know what a correct teaching is? How do I know what a correct interpretation of the Bible is? Because it just seems totally subjective within Protestantism, and how I wrestled with that. And then now capping off with the Bible itself. Who has the correct scriptures? The Catholic Church does. So, yeah, that's going to do it. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to leave a comment down below. I apologize for the gap between these videos coming out. I'm planning on responding to some questions that I've gotten in my next video. In particular, how has my family responded to me becoming Catholic, as well as, family, friends, and church people. I'll do that in the next video. But anyways, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you around the Tiber.